Wonderful. Well, it's about 10 o'clock, so we may have people who join us a little later, and that's fine. Um, for everyone who's on, just want to let you know we are recording, and that is because we would like to use this training for people who may not have been able to make it live this morning, and also potentially in the future, because one of the things about the Methodist Church is with anyone who works with vulnerable populations, we need to do this training annually. So it would be nice if we could just say, hey, watch this awesome video that we did. So that is the reason. I believe most of us know one another, and I'm happy to see so many smiling faces this morning. This is a group effort. The Safe Sanctuaries Committee is made up of people from the children's ministry, the youth ministry, older adults, vulnerable adults, the pastor. So there's a variety of people on the committee. Unfortunately, we have no males, but we're represented widely in other areas. And so we have brought to you this training this morning, our annual training. A lot of the information may be similar to last year, but we have significantly changed the policy, and you will see that. And you will also see we have made the training a little more interactive and created some case studies and scenarios so you can see how this would play out in like a real world scenario. So please feel free to ask questions. And there will be a variety of presenters. We'll go back and forth. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see the presentation. It'll be available to you after. And also everyone who has participated today, and then in the future, if anybody watches the video of the recording, we have a survey for you to fill out. Just, assessing what you were able to take away from the training today, and also just attesting that you do agree that you have been trained and that you will be following the policy to the best of your ability. So we promise it's not like a college exam, but it's just a way for us to make sure that you got what you needed to get from the training. So that'll be coming to you after the end of the training today, if you could please fill it out. So let me share my screen. Does anybody have questions before we get started? One thing I was going to add, just Zoom wise, if you're not presenting, if you don't mind putting yourself on mute, so then the quality of the sound for whoever is presenting will be better. And, then if you do wish to ask a question, or if it's your turn to present, just make sure you take yourself off mute. Everybody's tried to ask a question and they've accidentally been on mute, and that's fine. But that'll just help us along. All right, thank you so much. And I'm going to I'll share my screen. If there's any issues, could somebody on the committee just let me know that you can't see it? All right.
Looks good.
Looks good? Okay, perfect. All right. So welcome to our training. This is our training, and really the point is to make sure that anybody who's coming into contact with children, youth, older, and vulnerable adults at church understands how to prevent abuse and neglect, and also address it if it happens. So the title is Keeping Our Community a Place of Safety. Thank you for coming. All right, so I'm just going to start out with some basic terms. You're probably familiar with all of these terms: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. There are differences between them. Physical abuse is more intentional. Neglect is more like a failure to meet basic needs. Emotional abuse is really hard to prove, but it's things like putting a child or adult down, name calling, shaming. And then sexual abuse is pressuring or forcing someone to engage in the sexual acts. So just wanted to throw those terms out there because those are some of the topics we'll be talking about today, and just some basic definitions. Like I said, you'll have access to this PowerPoint if you want to refer back to that. Some signs. So, we have a good group of children who attend our church, and we also have children who come in as visitors all the time. So just some things to note. This is not all inclusive, and every child is different and reacts differently to their environment. But, if you see some of these signs, like, it's never a bad idea to potentially just ask open-ended questions like, how is it going? How are you doing? You certainly don't want to ask leading questions like, who is abusing you? But, just definitely things to watch out for with the children and youth at our church who come in and out of our church. If they lack supervision, if they're overly passive, withdrawn, dropped off early, stays late, difficulty concentrating. And these things, could be symptoms of other things as well, but just some basic things to watch out for. All right, and Dr. Johnson is going to talk to us about older and vulnerable adults and what that might look like. Oh, Dr. Johnson, you're on mute. Yeah.
You're still muted.
Let me go back.
I can't hear anything.
Yeah, so she's on mute, so she may be having some technical difficulties. But these are some additional terms that we have added to our training related to older and vulnerable adults. Financial abuse and exploitation. You guys may have all heard about, like, in the news about scammers trying to reach out to maybe older adults who are not as familiar with, like, email or like online and how to protect themselves. And they will give their personal information out to people who should not have it. Dr. Johnson, if you're off mute, you can go ahead and join in. Yeah.
I'm on my iPad, and sometimes when I try to click on, I'm just probably going to stay on unmuted because I cannot always get it unmuted, and I went all the way out. So, but thank you, Alice. And I would like to just say in introducing this part also is that over half of the members of New Creation are in the category of older adults, and that would be persons who are 50 years and older. And I'll just go with the second one. Alice talked about the financial abuse and exploitation of older and vulnerable adults, which is a new category that we have added to the Safe Sanctuary policy. And so this is something that we really do need to pay close attention to. And the spiritual neglect is one that we probably have heard very little about. But it is the failure of the church or other religious entity to provide the necessary spiritual care for the faith development and spiritual well-being of older adults. And you will see some examples of that in one of the scenarios at the end. And in regards to this one, these are some signs. And one of the things I would like to say before we go into these is that some of these things you may see in older and vulnerable adults, which may not be abuse. But as Alice indicated, we do need to watch for those because continued signs such as this may need questioning. So when we look at people who may have untreated injuries, open wounds, discoloration, bed sores, and of course, some of these things you will not be able to observe unless you're actually working individually with the person. And things like broken eyeglasses, I might sit on mine. That doesn't mean that I've been abused and my glasses are broken, but in some cases, this is a sign you may want to look for. Unusual agitation, as we tend to get older, that may be a sign that we just go through. But if it is a continued kind of thing for someone who has not been agitated a lot, it may be cause for examination. Extreme attempts to seek others' approval. And if you look at some of these, you will see that as they say, oh, the person go back into the second childhood, you may see some of the things that children do as well. Then the lack of communication and unresponsiveness, people who may have been communicating regularly or frequently, and then all of a sudden are not communicating, are becoming unresponsive to inquiries or conversation, may be cause for concern. And then inappropriate dress for the climate, people who are wearing a winter coat when it's 90 degrees outside, there may be some concern for looking at that situation. Dehydration, malnutrition, or chronic hunger. Sometimes when people get old, they do lose appetites and may not want to eat. But if you're looking at that, certainly those kinds of situations can lead to very serious kinds of illness that will be a cause for alert. And then also poor personal hygiene, persons who may not be bathing regularly, may not have unclean clothes, and that the face not washed, hair is not clean. Those are some signs that there could be abuse and neglect of older and vulnerable adults.
Thank you. So, you know, for these reasons, because, you know, we could have members or visitors to our church who are displaying these signs, who are going through these things, we need to have these policies in place at our church to protect the welfare, children, youth, older, and vulnerable persons when they're participating in the life of the church. So this is why we have this policy, why we have this committee. We last updated the policy. It was approved by the Administrative Council in March of this year. So there have been some updates. And so we wanted to introduce those updates and do the training for you today. So we'll try to highlight anytime there's a change. I would say the first major change is that we included older and vulnerable adults into the policy intentionally. So the entire policy has that language throughout. So it is no longer a policy just about preventing and addressing child abuse. So thank you. All right, so why do we need to be a safe sanctuary church? To demonstrate our commitment to the safety of everyone, basically. I would say a majority of the people who attend our church fall into these categories. So we need to be committed to the safety of everyone, not just physical safety, but emotional, financial, and spiritual safety. And the United Methodist Church states that God calls us to make churches safe places, protecting everyone from sexual and ritual abuse. God calls us to create communities of faith where children and adults grow safe and strong. So that's why we're doing this. And here's another quote from the social principles on the rights of the aging. Dr. Johnson, you want to talk about that?
Okay, yes. And this particular statement is disciplinary, but it's actually taken from a little book that is written completely on the social principles of the United Methodist Church. And this one happens to include a paragraph on the rights of the aging. And I'm just going to read the first part of that because I think that's the part that shows the importance of us including this in our policy and presenting it today. In a society that places primary emphasis upon youth, those who are growing older in years are frequently isolated from the mainstream of social existence. We support social principles that integrate the aged into the life of the total community, including sufficient incomes, increased and non-discriminatory employment opportunities, educational and service opportunities, and adequate medical care and housing within existing communities. And so with this, the church has pledged that it is dedicated to making sure that we also include within our congregation the care of those persons who are aging and who are vulnerable.
Thank you. So now we're going to talk about what this looks like with the policy here at New Creation. So I'm going to invite our SPPRC chair, Nicolette Weeks, to talk a little bit about staff recruitment selection, what that looks like.
All right, thanks, Alice. Next slide. So there's a lot of information about agent selection, so I'm going to kind of read a lot of it from the slide. All volunteers and paid staff working with children and youth in any position of authority must meet the following criteria. You have to be at least 16 years of age and at least 5 years older than the age of the persons they're working to serve. You must complete and attest to doing the annual Safe Sanctuary training, and you must complete a satisfactory background check. Paid staff must be at least 18 years of age in addition to the above criteria that I mentioned above. Unpaid volunteers may work with children, youth, older adults, and vulnerable persons if they are at least 16 years of age to work with children and youth, and 18 years of age to work with older and vulnerable adults, as a member of good standing on the implicit reference of the children's, youth, or older adult chairperson and the pastor. And this person must also do a satisfactory background check and the annual Safe Sanctuary training. Background checks are done to determine the current or historic child abuse or sexual misconduct, criminal records, violent or pedophiliac behavior. Interviews will be conducted by the leader of the program in which the applicant will work or by other persons designated by the program leader. Church policy and guidelines will be discussed during the interview, and the result of this background check will be reviewed by the pastor, Safe Sanctuary chairperson, either the children's ministry or youth ministry chairpersons. Specifically, individuals who have been convicted of physical or sexual abuse or neglect may not work in any church-sponsored activity or program for preschoolers, children, youth, and vulnerable adults if they have any type of prior convictions related to those items. This information will be confidential. This selected information will be marked as such and stored in a locked location with limited access afforded to only church staff and others with the need to know. All applicants to the paid staff will sign an authorization and request for criminal background check form and will acknowledge receipt of this form in agreement with the child, youth, older adult, and vulnerable persons abuse prevention policy as part of the application process. And annually, again, we have to acknowledge the receipt of and the agreement of the same form again with the abuse prevention policy as part of the application process, and it will provide an electronic or written consent for a criminal background check.
All right, so now we're going to talk about what it looks like to work with all of our vulnerable populations here at the church. So I believe Sashir, who is primarily working with our youth group, is going to help us out with this next section.
All right. Hi, everybody. So for this particular section, I'm just going to provide an overview. As the church grows, we may revise this policy to indicate that volunteers must be 18 and must be unrelated. However, we want our current policy to blend of practicality and conscious if the group stays overnight at a church or if there's a church-sponsored activity and the group leaves the premises. We want to have 2 or more leaders and they must be present and must include at least 1 male and 1 female if the group is of mixed gender. So definitely wanted to highlight this part, and it's also very important that We have 2 approved volunteers or paid staff at all times working with our kids. That's for the children's safety, and it's also for our safety as adults as well. One must be an adult that's over the age of 21, and whenever possible, like I said, the 2 individuals should be over the age of 18. However, given that we're a small congregation, the leadership has agreed that there may be times when a second volunteer is between the ages of 16 and 18. This is permissible as long as they have taken all the steps that are required of adult volunteers. And go ahead to the next one. And the church shall make a concerted effort to recruit more teachers and volunteers so that there can be 2 adults in every classroom and on every outing. In order to prevent child abuse, the responsible persons need to be more than just physically present in a classroom or on a trip. They need to be an active supervisor, even if it seems like nothing is going to happen. And that's very important, an active supervisor. As you guys know, I'm in the classroom, so it's not enough to be physically present. We have to be actively present and actively supervising children, because things happen in a split second. So that's very important. All right, so regarding check-in and check-out procedures, this is extremely important as well. Nursery age children, parents / staff will observe a written check-in and check-out procedure as outlined in a nursery policy manual. Preschool and elementary school age children, ages 4 and up, must be dropped off and picked up from all activities by a parent / guardian or their designee, unless other arrangements have been made with the teacher. We need to get the names of caregivers who drop off older adults to church events as well. And that's very important. There can be situations, you never know. And this is a section we shouldn't take for granted, because there could be a situation where there could be a custody situation. Somebody it may be in a situation where someone's not supposed to have contact with the child. So it's important to know who's supposed to pick the child up and who's supposed to take them from the facility.
Here, this is Donita. I just wanted to mention what's not covered on here is children's church, where children are dismissed in front of everybody and go back with the 2 teachers to the children's room and then come back in. That doesn't require a parent sign off.
Right.
Mm-hmm. But what that means is that, if a child comes back for children's church and then wants to go to nursery, we can't do that. We have to take them back into the sanctuary, and then the parent would need to take them to nursery.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you.
So for openness and accountability, parents / guardians or their designee, clergy, staff, and caregivers may visit and observe any activity, classroom, or church-sponsored program for children, youth, older, and vulnerable adults at any time unannounced. There must also be access to a phone or cell phone when groups are at or away from the church facility. The church office or authorized church representative will be given this number prior to the group's departure from church property. And it's also important that doors and windows of our classrooms or office doors there's some visibility there from the hallway, and they remain open while occupied. And again, that's to ensure the safety of children and adults. So individual meetings with children and youth, great care should be taken at any time that there is a one-on-one interaction with youth and children. Interaction should always occur in an environment that is visible by other adults. Another adult shall be made aware of staff members' whereabouts and those whom they are meeting with, and make sure that the youth / or child is aware that they are free to discuss any aspects of the meeting with a parent or other adult, especially if they are uncomfortable about anything that occurs.
All right, and so Danita is going to tell us about a new part of our policy. We specifically made a policy about the bathroom.
Yeah, so the bathroom policy, the bottom line is that we want to, give kind of monitor children as they go to the bathroom to give them protection, but also not invade their privacy. So young children will be escorted to the bathroom, and this is very convenient at our church because the nursery and the Sunday school room share a bathroom in between them. And so what that might look like is, the door would be closed to one of the rooms. Say it's a child from the nursery. The caregiver could close the door to the children's side of the room, maybe just tell the teachers we're going to be using the bathroom here, and then the child can use the bathroom. Now, if the adult needs to assist with the child in the bathroom, then we'll leave the door open, and so that the second adult, is there for accountability. If it's an older child, we might, in children's church, we might tell the nursery workers, we're going to use the bathroom now, close that door, and then let the child use the bathroom on their own. But an adult will be outside the bathroom door in case the child needs assistance. And also the other adult will remain in the room with the children. So if this happens to, if for some reason the children need to go to the larger bathroom, then we use kind of similar principles. One adult will help the child while the other adult watches the other children and kind of watches the first adult to give each other accountability. And if a child needs assistance, then the bathroom stall needs to remain open while the child goes to the bathroom. Next slide. So when it comes to youth and adults, the youth may go to the restroom one at a time, and the teachers will just, keep track of that and make sure, and go check if it takes a long time or something like that. But during youth group meetings, the class could be taken as a group, and then the adults can just monitor outside of the classroom. We wanted to explicitly state that transgender identifying youth or adults may use the restroom of their preferred gender. And for older and vulnerable adults, we want to make sure that our restrooms are easily accessible with visible signage.
And Danita, I just wanted to add something to,
yes,
and particularly with youth. Right now we're small in number, so it's like 3 of them, so it's definitely easier to instill the one at a time. But as the group grows, we have the taking them as a group for a particular reason. With this age group, there's a lot of shenanigans that can happen with bathrooms. So this is why this policy is very important and and it's in place because they're, as a middle school teacher for 13 years, there's a lot of foolishness that can occur, and just for the safety of our children, adults, this is why this is in place. So this is why one at a time is always good. You don't want them having multiple people, because what if there's something said that's inappropriate or bullying or something posted on social media, like so there's a lot of things that could go wrong. So this is why we have that policy in place.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, and I just thought about this too. I think this also right now intersects with the church COVID policy, which I think on the doors of the restrooms, they limit the number of people in the restrooms anyway. So I don't know, it kind of works out in our favor. But yes, that was one of the reasons that the committee added the bathroom policy, is because, in addition to the concern of an adult potentially abusing a child at church, there is also an additional concern of a child inappropriately touching another child at church. And so we're just trying to prevent any situation where that may occur. And a lot of times, like Sashir said, that could occur in the bathroom. All right, physical contact, Shashir.
All right, so physical affection should be appropriate to the age of the child, youth, older adult, and vulnerable persons. Touching should be initiated by the child or the youth, and should be appropriate to their needs for encouragement and comforting. Ideally, touching and affection should only be given when it's in the presence of other children's ministry or youth workers. It is much less likely that touches will be inappropriate or misconstrued as such when two adult workers are present and the touching is open to observation. This is especially important when diapering a baby or helping a young child change clothes or the restroom. And also, you don't want a child to feel like they're being touched, like they may not feel like giving an adult a hug, so if they want to hug you, it's safe to say, and of course, we joke and say the church hug, you would just safely kind of give somebody the side hug. So you just want to be careful with the physical contact aspect of things, and that's something I have to remember too. I'm a hugger, but you want the child or the youth to initiate that first, so they're comfortable, because you don't want to hug them and they're like, oh, I feel uncomfortable, this adult is touching me, All right, and as ministry workers, our behavior must foster trust at all times. It should be above reproach. A child's, youth, older or vulnerable person's preference not to be touched should always be respected. Church workers are responsible to protect children under their supervision from any inappropriate touching by others. Church workers must promptly discuss inappropriate touching or other questionable behavior by other workers, as well as other children, with their ministry leader, staff member, or a pastor. Older adults and vulnerable persons are to be protected from unwanted and inappropriate touching and affection.
Can I ask, so the fourth point, how to promptly discuss inappropriate touching. What's an example of something people could say if they see something and say the child doesn't look comfortable with it?
You could say something directly to the person, or you can, I would say, like, say if there was another worker, like say if they hug the child and the child looks physically uncomfortable, I would definitely speak with the child about it, or in the ministry leader, and definitely you want to speak to the person. Like, say if somebody gave a hug, we'll use an example of a hug. Say Alice hugs me. I'm gonna use me and Alice as an example. Alice hugs me. You notice that I feel uncomfortable, Danita. I would talk to the child. I would talk to Alice, and it's always good to err on the side of caution to say, hey, Alice hugs Ashir. She didn't look comfortable with the hug, but you could say Alice didn't mean any harm or unintended, but we want to give you a heads up that occurred, kind of thing. The child looked uncomfortable.
Yeah, and Danita, that's a great question. Like, let's say I'm walking into the nursery and I happen to see an uncomfortable hug. I might even, to make it less awkward for everyone involved, like if it's in the middle of it, I would be like, hey, Jewel, are you comfortable right now? Like, was that like a weird hug? And then like after the fact, like I could talk to the adult about it. But in that moment, I could like connect with the child and be like, sounds like you didn't want that hug, And so that way it's out there and it's the truth, but it's not like an overly uncomfortable moment.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And it would be also if you have a kid that hugs another kid and they don't feel comfortable, that's something that you could talk to the kids about and just say like, hey, such and such looks like they don't want to be touched right now. So
yep,
do that.
Yep. And that happens a lot with like preschoolers. Yeah.
Well, how do you maintain an inviting, warm, caring atmosphere with all of these restrictions? For example, Michelle was in the vestibule one day, and her mother was working in the kitchen. And I passed by her and say, "Michelle, aren't you beautiful today? I wish you would go home with me," and I'm going. And Michelle got up and she was ready to go home with me. So I said to her, "You cannot go. I have to go check with your mom." And I went to the kitchen and told her what happened.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that Lachelle kind of took you literally and she wanted to just come away with you and you wanted to talk to her mom about it?
Because I knew her mother and I knew that I wanted her to feel that she could go with me if she wanted to. At
Sure.
the same time, there was a situation where I brought my nephew to church, and he was downstairs with two adult people that I know very well, Elisa and Melissa, and he was alone with them because of his age group, and he was the only person with them, and he felt uncomfortable with them, and came back upstairs and told me what happened and said that he couldn't go back unless I signed him in, and he didn't understand that.
Okay. I think, you know, the whole purpose of all of these, I guess, guidelines would be the best way to put it, is for the protection of everyone. And so I think it's going to be a give and take. So, you know, everyone may not always be 100% comfortable with all the guidelines, but the purpose for having them in place is for safety. And so sometimes when you have things in place for safety, it doesn't always generate the most warm and fuzzy conversation, but in the end, it protects everybody. But I appreciate your example.
Asking is, how can we compromise, make the environment inviting, comfortable, warm, and caring?
Yes, and I think that our volunteers and our staff do a wonderful job of developing those relationships with the children who do attend the different programs, because I don't necessarily think that having a sign-in sheet prevents the atmosphere from being welcoming and inviting. So I think you can have both. But we can continue to work on that, Ms. Lincoln.
Yes, all that I'm saying without being argumentative is that some children who have come to our church have reported back to their parents that they were very uncomfortable and in the presence of other members of the church. And I'm asking that we consider this and make the environment warm and caring so that visiting children who come would want to return.
Okay, and I think that's a wonderful ask. And I would just ask too, I think anytime anybody feels uncomfortable, that it gets reported, you know, fairly quickly, and then we can continue to work on that. Yeah, I think that would be the best thing to do. All right. So Sheer, were we going to talk about outings away from the church?
Yes, so this is something that we wanted to discuss because it's very important. Outings away from church property with children and youth. All children and youth participating in out of town and overnight outings must have written consent, church permission slip, and a medical release form. Medical release and permission slips may be completed for a 1-year period and must be renewed annually. A phone, cell phone, or a pager should be available. I mean, no one really uses pagers like that anymore unless they're a doctor, but you know, we have that. Must be available when groups are away from church property. One adult other than the parent should never take a child or children on an overnight outing alone. So that's extremely important. For outings, there should be a 1-to-7 staff ratio with youth supervision ratio observed on away from church, away from the church overnight outings. When they're on away, they're 1-to-7 ratio. Female staff will supervise female youth in their sleeping quarters, and male staff will supervise male youth. Married couples will not stay together, but observe the female and male sleeping arrangements, with the exception of a parent and child combination. A staff and or youth will not occupy the same bed or sleeping bag.
All right, so another change to our policy is we slightly changed the discipline policy, and Nicolette was going to tell us a little bit more about that.
All right, thank you, Alice. So in the classroom, all teachers and workers need to make sure they use the following discipline measures. If a child is behaving inappropriately, let's say they're playing with blocks and they started throwing them, the teacher or the worker tell the child to not throw the blocks. We're going to use the blocks for building. So we just kind of redirect them from what they were doing to try to state to what the expected behavior is and how they should be playing. If this measure is not effective, the child will be moved on to another activity. If that behavior continues, child may be isolated, and at this point, the teachers don't need to ridicule or keep the children from ridiculing the child being isolated. If isolating the child within the classroom or removing the child from the classroom is necessary, the situation will be discussed with the child's parent or guardian and student as soon as possible. If that behavior still continues after these steps have been taken, the teacher will notify the parents and then notify the children's ministry coordinator or the SPPR chairperson of the conversation. And at no time physical punishment or verbal abuse are to be used. Next slide.
Sorry, I don't know why it's not going to the next slide.
Oh, it's fine.
Oh, is that the
Okay.
next? Yes. Okay.
And at times it may be necessary for adults or responsible person working with our children, youth, older adults, and vulnerable persons to provide some type of reasonable basic of first aid and touching. It could be something as small as cleaning a scrape or giving someone a Band-Aid. We make sure to keep the first aid kit accessible to staff and volunteers. And just make sure that anybody that's working with the kids, whether they're paid staff or volunteers, that an incident report will be filled out and presented to the child's parent or guardian after the incident happened. Other things to think about, sometimes we want to, show our appreciation by giving a gift. Make sure you just kind of have parental clergy knowledge prior to giving this gift to individual children or youth, and it should be done on a group basis, not one individual child, or it could be for a special occasion like a birthday. So just make sure if you give any gifts that is nothing super elaborate. With training policy, going forward, this training is a requirement for new paid staff and new volunteers. And additionally, you've all been asked throughout the training to make sure you've read the policy and that you'll adhere to it. And, we're now in a world of virtual activities with COVID and everything. And it seems like we may be doing virtual things for a while. We just need to make sure we continue to use a video conferencing platform such as Zoom. And these events should be password protected and have the waiting room feature enabled. And there should be at least one supervising adult that's 21 years or older to be present to supervise any official virtual activities for our children and youth. And efforts will be made to work with our older and vulnerable adults on communicating in cyberspace.
So we come to the part of our training where we want to make it a little interactive. So we have a case study scenario, and Donita is going to lead us in this and just a few questions to think about.
Yeah, so I'll read the case study, and the point of this, as Alice mentioned, is to be a little interactive. We're interested in hearing from everyone, and there'll be, during the questions that are coming, there'll be an opportunity for you to either unmute and give your thoughts, or if you prefer, please put them in the chat, and I'll read what goes into the chat. So Cora was an older adult member and an active volunteer in her small membership church. She was a widow with limited income. She paid her tithes and gave additional donations for special projects, and she taught Sunday school and was a communion steward. She prepared the sanctuary for worship and prepared elements for Holy Communion each week. But suddenly, Cora suffered a stroke that left her paralyzed on one side of her body, and she was unable to speak clearly. After her acute medical needs were taken care of in the hospital, she was discharged to the only nursing home in town, located about 3 miles from the church. Cora had no living relatives in the town. Next slide. Cora's pastor never visited her or any other members in the nursing home. The pastor never brought communion to Cora or any others in the nursing home, and no congregational care team was formed to make visits or tend to Cora. None of the persons who worked with Cora as communion stewards came to visit. Cora died 10 years later, and when her granddaughter called the church to make the arrangements for Cora's funeral, the pastor did not seem to remember who Cora was, but he agreed to allow the family to use the church for her funeral. So how would you describe the pastor's behavior towards Cora during her years in the nursing home? And what kind of abuse or neglect did Cora experience? Again, feel free to unmute or to put your answers in the chat.
Well, Cora was neglected by the entire congregation, not just the pastor.
I agree.
And could the pastor have been changed during that period of time and not knowing?
Then that's possible. It might have been a new pastor, and then and how could that have? And then where would the kind of fault be?
It would be in the old pastor as well for not making him aware of the person's situation and where she was and how committed a church member she had been prior to her stroke. I think that it was callous and uncaring and definitely unchristian of this entire congregation.
That's what I learned recently in a workshop, that it would probably not be the pastor's responsibility, but maybe the caregiving team's responsibility to keep the pastor informed.
Everything everybody has said is absolutely correct. I just add that, it's sort of, I don't know whether hypocritical is the right word, but since we use the word community all the time in church, it's sort of hard to live out with specifics, especially when people are, having extra troubles. How do you create community with that person, with Cora?
You let her know she hasn't been forgotten.
That's right.
Yeah.
And that's a good segue to our next couple of questions, which are on the next slide. This was an egregious scenario, right? I think we could all agree, like, whoa, how could that happen? So let's talk about a few things that, how could the pastor and the congregation have prevented this kind of abuse and neglect of Cora, one of their members?
By working together with the, if they have a membership care team or whatever, so that maybe there's a rotation on the different people visiting. So the pastor wouldn't have to carry the full load, but certainly could be there to provide communion on Sundays, and then other people could be there. One person a week even would have been a blessing to this woman in this situation.
And I think the thing, Danita and Ruth, here is that this is a case of spiritual neglect, because the same kind of spiritual encouragement and nourishment that's given to those persons who attend worship service and who participate in the ministries through the week should also be given to those persons who may no longer be able to become a part actively, physically, in the worship and in the ministries of the church. So as our friend indicated, she should have been carried the communion. There should have been someone to pray with her, to sit with her during the week. There should have been someone to make sure that her relatives were contacted and to get, the kinds of things that they needed for her. But she should not have been spiritually neglected, as well as the other kinds of neglect that we find in this scenario.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And if we look at the bottom question, it says an alternative scenario is that the pastor visits Cora in the nursing home, but no one else from the small congregation visited or tended to her. And is this also spiritual abuse and neglect? And I would argue it is, because it's not, as Ms. Lincoln said, it's not just the pastor's job to do this. And it might not even be primarily the pastor's job. We're a church and we're a community, and we all need to play a role. So I'd like to just end this with one last question to you: is what kind of things do we do at New Creation that can prevent this type of spiritual neglect from happening?
We have a wonderful caregiving team, and the pastor is diligent in contacting all of her members. But also in this workshop recently, they assigned more to the parish pastor relationship team to do these sorts of things in addition to the caregiving team. And the parish relation team's job is not just to do what is necessary when there's going to be a change or something like that, but it's a daily own giving team that works with the pastor and pastor-parish relationships such as this.
And Anita, I think very seriously, I think the need for the training that we are going through now is important, so church members would not find themselves involved. Well, we would not allow a member of our become involved in a situation such as this, because we've had the training and we know what our responsibilities are in our office responsibility training, as well as with this particular training.
That's right. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating here. We'll do another couple of scenarios at the end.
Yes, thank you. All right, so we've come to the not so fun part where, as the resident social worker of the congregation, I get to talk about how we respond if something does happen to children, youth, older, or vulnerable persons when the unimaginable happens. So first off, in the state of North Carolina, we are a mandated reporting state. And what that means is sometimes a state will say just first responders are mandated reporters. But in North Carolina, anyone who knows anything about anything suspicious going on is a mandated reporter. So so legally we have to. But I think, from the Methodist policy, it talks about how it is a ministry and a witness. It is our moral responsibility to report any suspected abuse or neglect wherever it happens or whenever it comes to our attention. And a reporting is a form of ministering to the needs of vulnerable individuals. So even if it turns out not to be true, taking that precaution and doing that you're ministering to that person, you're making sure that their needs are taken care of, that somebody is going to come and assess the situation. So you're witnessing to the world of the love and justice of God. This is just the text of the North Carolina law around mandated reporting, the duty to report. Of course, any person who knowingly or wantonly fails to report the case of a juvenile specifically is guilty of a class 1 misdemeanor. I don't know if a lot of people know that. I just included that. I'm not going to read it, but you guys will have access to it after. And then, of course, the same would be true of elder abuse, just protecting disabled adults of any age. We need to do that, and the law protects that. Any person having any reasonable cause to believe that a disabled adult is in need of protective services shall report that. So our policy just kind of walks you through if we suspect, observe, or someone discloses to us as a volunteer or a paid staff member what we need to do. So we will, first and foremost, if you get this information or you see it happen, or a child or a vulnerable person tells you it happened, you need to ensure their safety. So first and foremost, before we do anything else, you need to make sure they're in a safe place, whether that's, sitting in pastor's office or, with their favorite nursery worker or whatever that looks like. Make sure they're safe. Immediately contact the pastor or whoever's on call covering for the pastor, as well as the proper authorities. So what that would look like, let's say that's during church on a Sunday. that would be like the SPPRC chair, or that would be me as the Safe Sanctuaries chair, or the Children's Church chair, which would be Donita or Rachel, or Sashir if it's a youth. She's the youth chair. But basically, they will help whoever that person is that you've contacted, whether it's the pastor or any of us. We will make sure that you report it to the proper authorities. So that would be, since we're in the county of Durham, we have used the Durham Police Department or the Durham Child Protective Services or Adult Services. You know, logistically, if it's on the weekend, you're going to be calling the Sheriff's Department and making an after hours report. Those numbers are going to be on the next slide. If it is like a weekday during business hours, then you could contact their lines directly. Sometimes people are nervous about making a report, or they're afraid that they don't have all the appropriate information. So that's why in our policy, we, you know, you can make that report together with me or with Nicolette or with Pastor, you know, making that report, but it needs to be made. And, you know, it's not up to us whether it gets screened in or screened out. That'll be up to, you know, the police department, Child Protective Services, Adult Services. You know, if it meets the definition, they'll screen it in. If it doesn't, we've done our due diligence. We've done what we needed to do. So there are things in our policy, just in case this were to ever happen. If the pastor is the accused party, let's say there's something that happens and the pastor is accused of doing something, then Nicolette would need to notify the district superintendent. And then after this report is taken by, you know, Durham CPS will provide just like a written documentation of what happened to Nicolette, the chair of the SPPRC. And these emergency numbers are going to be available to anybody working with children and youth. And I'm going to also say older and vulnerable adults. Like I said, on the weekends, you're going to be calling 911 and asking to speak to the social worker on call. I'm going to give you the numbers on the next slide. Yeah. So these are the numbers for Durham Police, which is after 5 p.m. during the week and on the weekends for children and adults. And then if it's during the week, something happens, these are the intake report lines for Adult Protective Services and Child Protective Services. And I will say this, I'll keep saying it, even if you don't think it rises to the level, you don't know that for sure because you're not the professional who screens in or out the report. So it's always better to err on the side of caution and just make a report. Reporter identity is anonymous. The only way that your identity could be revealed to the family is if it is ordered by a judge, like a court order. And that is like very, very, very extremely rare. So these numbers are important. We'll make sure that they're posted at the church, but also you guys will get a copy of these slides.
Alice, before you go any further on this one, this is very serious that you're talking about now in terms of this reporting. And I'm wondering how we capture the concern that, you know, when someone is accused falsely, how that hurts the congregation and the individual and can cause a real split even in churches. So how do you kind of work between the caution of making sure, you know, that you report something that you suspect and then not falsely accusing someone, causing them, you know, a permanent scar or whatever?
Right. Well, you know, reports, that's a good question. You know, reports about the well-being or welfare of a child or adult is we're not making a criminal report most of the time. Now, sometimes if what we're reporting is sexual or like extreme physical abuse in nature, it becomes criminal. But, you know, if those authorities begin to investigate and they decide that the report is not true, not accurate, then, then it never would rise to that level. But I'll get to that in a second. That's a good point. And that's the reason why we keep this confidential, because it's a very serious situation and we don't want to interfere in any sort of assessment that goes on, whether they find that person to be responsible or not, we're going to keep it confidential. And so there's only certain people at the church who would even know that this is going on. And I think that would prevent something like, improper blaming or shaming of someone from occurring, because, that would be unfair as well. But that's a good point, Dr. Johnson. Just because somebody has said something about someone, that doesn't necessarily mean that it happened. Yeah. So with the reporting, the pastor or designee, so the pastor or like myself or Nicolette or Sashir or someone from Children's Church like Danita will notify the parents, next of kin, or caregiver of the victim and take whatever steps are necessary to assure the safety of that person, whatever that looks like, until their parents, next of kin, caregiver arrives. And after the report has been made to the authorities, which in 99% of cases would be Durham, DSS, or police, it will be reported to the district superintendent. And if it's a very, very serious allegation, it may need to be reported to the bishop. Okay. So if they're working with children, so let's say the person who's accused is like a volunteer or a staff member, they will be removed from further involvement with children and youth. And given what you asked, Bernice, this could be a temporary removal until we find out exactly what happened. Because you're right, it could just be totally false and maybe they could be reinstated. But, as a precaution, they will be temporarily removed. And if the accused, like we talked about earlier, if it's another child who has maybe inappropriately touched a child or something like that, the pastor will speak with that child's parent about that child or youth stepping back from activities until the investigation has been concluded, whatever that looks like. And then.
Please forgive me for interrupting.
Yes.
But this a little bit absurd in a way with children who have vivid imaginations and have been taught some things in some homes and not in other homes. For example, my grandchild with his mother in a public restroom cried, child abuse. And she said, if you don't shut your mouth, you'll find out what abuse is all about.
Ooh.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, I wouldn't say it's absurd. There is documented cases of abuse that take place in congregations. My actual home church, we had to deal with a situation when I was 18, when there was a summer camp and they weren't being watched appropriately by some workers that were outside of the church. And we had another child actually touch another child inappropriately. And there was no policy in place to deal with that. So it's not absurd. Abuse happens all the time. Alice is a social worker. I work in a school system. We see it every day. So it's about having policies in place, and we know what happened with the Catholic Church. So it's important, and this is why our denomination as a whole has this whole safe sanctuary policy in itself. And we're doing that as a church to take precautions. So when things are in place, we know what to do if this unimaginable occurs. And that's why she titled it that way. So I would not say it's absurd. These things happen. You may not come in contact with that, but these things do happen. So we're just erring on the side of caution. That's what this training is all about. Because everybody that is required to attend this training are people who work with children or vulnerable adults. So we just need to know what to do if a situation arises. So it's never bad to be prepared.
I'd like to
I want to be argumentative. And remember, I am a retired educator and administrator in public schools and understand. And children perceive things differently from their home training and how they have been taught. And sometimes they can project what others might appear to know as an embrace, and another child might interpret that as abuse. Now, we have ministers in our church who comes to our homes, and they pick up our children and they hug them, and they may even kiss them on the cheek, and the children love it. They put their hands around their pastors' necks and hugs them. And this is recently too. Now, we are promoting an atmosphere where that might, in another case, be child abuse. And I'm not saying that we can't observe this, and I respect these orders and these guidelines, but at the same time, there should be equal guidelines about what people can do to make the environment embracing and loving, and people and others want to.
Oh my God.
So thank you, Miss Lincoln. I just, and for the sake of time, I'm going to move us forward. But what I will say about that is the pastor has been, well, and I'm not sure if you're speaking specifically about our church, and that's fine, but our specific pastor, she always asks my children if she can give them a hug. And then if they say yes, she gives the biggest hugs, and they love it, and it's very welcoming and inviting. And I really respect the way she does that, because there's no question that there's any unwanted physical contact. But I think that's a little bit off topic from what I'm presenting right now. So I'm just going to go ahead and finish it because I'm almost done. And then we have a couple more scenarios that I would like the group to look at and kind of process. So for example, I was talking about the accused. So the pastor will talk to if the accused, if there has been someone accused of abuse or neglect in the church, the pastor will have that conversation with them after the report has been made. And if they're a staff member, while their investigation is going on, if it is accepted for an investigation, because sometimes it's not, but if it is, they will be relieved of their duties until the investigation is completed. And then and I will also say the whole point of the last part of this is I hope we never, ever, ever have to use this part of the policy. I hope this part of the policy just collects dust until the end of time, but we have to have it just in case. So I will say that, if there is some larger thing going on and it becomes like a media situation, there will be a predetermined spokesperson. And then everything that happened, of any abuse that occurred at church, there will be a written report kept, and it will be kept in a confidential location. And we may also have to submit it to the bishop. So like I said, this is not fun, and this is not something that I foresee us using, but nobody ever foresees using something like this, but we do need to have it. So with that being said, I want to move us to the scenario, because I think some people's questions or comments may be best said with the scenarios, because there's going to be one about child abuse, and then there's going to be another one about elder abuse. Okay, so the next scenario, Donita.
Okay. Again, I'm going to read it, and then we'll have some questions, and I invite you to either answer out loud or use the chat, and I'll read what you write. A 4-year girl named Raven regularly attends nursery at her local church on Sunday mornings. She attends church with her grandmother, Mrs. B, who checks in on her before she goes off to join Sunday morning worship service. Who checks her in, I mean. The nursery workers have been having a difficult time getting to know Raven, as she has been reluctant to speak about anything. For the last 3 Sundays, she has come to the nursery very disheveled, her clothing dirty and out of place, her hair not combed, and her face not washed. And this is not normal for her. She has also been somewhat physically aggressive with her peers, and today she pushed a peer down on the playground. One of the nursery workers brought her to time out. Next slide. The nursery worker asked why she would push down her friend on the ground, and Raven stated that she didn't know, but she did share that there was a scary man coming to her house for the past few weeks. Her mother had a new friend named David, and she stated that David would get very angry and he would hit her. She stated that the past few nights he had also come into her room and got in bed with her. He would put his hand up her nightgown and her underwear, and she did not like that. She showed the nursery worker a bruise on her back from where David had hit her. So what should the nursery worker do next, according to Safe Sanctuary policy? And I invite you to answer this either out loud or in the chat. So if you're just a nursery work, if you're a nursery worker or a nursery volunteer, who is the next person you should report to?
SPPRC and Pastor.
That's right. Just one level up. So either Alice as Safe Sanctuary Chair, Nicolette as SPPRC Chair. You could actually contact me as the Children's Ministry Director or Pastor V directly. And I would just like to mention, in the context of our discussion earlier and kind of knowing, well, does this rise to something I need to report or not? Because again, like Dr. Johnson said, we don't want to falsely accuse someone or bring something up that might cause them a lot of trouble. I mean, a situation like this one, it's very clear. We need to report it. Something that's a little less clear, what I like is that we have this two-step process. You don't have to pick up the phone and call Child Protective Services. You can ask Alice, Nicolette, me, or Pastor and get some perspective. And so we're not in this alone. And that second question, who in the church needs to know this sensitive information about Raven?
I think, again, just the groups that you just named, because we certainly would want to have that go spill into the congregation. And I think Alice talked about keeping things confidential. So it would be within those groups. After those chairs are notified, you, Nicolette, Alice, and whoever the nursery school workers are, then they can decide about sharing it within those committee groups that they have. But I think that's something that the entire congregation would not get until after the things have been pretty much settled and a statement could be made.
How about the grandmother? Where does she fit into this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we get this a lot in CPS because we get calls from schools a lot, and they're like, the kid doesn't want to go home. What should we do? And I'm like, well, you guys don't have a right to just hold the kid, and you kind of have to send them back to their parent. So in this situation, we do need to release her to her caregiver. And so and because, given what has been reported as it has been written, which I basically threw you guys the kitchen sink. I wrote this. So I gave you physical abuse and sexual abuse and neglect all in the same scenario. That doesn't happen always. But yes, it is perfectly fine to speak to the non-offending caregiver and let them know, because it's part of their role to create safety for her. So yeah, if this was to be accepted, it would be accepted as an immediate response report. So somebody would come out pretty quickly, but even so, like, the grandmother would need to know what's going on. So I would imagine that the pastor would be involved in that conversation.
Thank you. Let's go to the next slide.
Before you
There's
do
one
that,
question.
please, may I ask how do you assess the truthfulness of the report of a child and before it is processed as being truth?
You don't assess the truthfulness. That is not your job. The job as somebody who has been reported to, the job is just to report it to the people who are going to investigate. It's not your job to assess the truthfulness. And that's good because depending on the age and the developmental level and the individual background of the child, there are professional forensic investigators that'll come in and they will do a forensic interview with her. And so it's good to not ask additional questions because that's not our role. We just need to report what we know.
Thank you for affirming that.
Yeah.
Yes, and that leads into this next question. What are some ways that the nursery workers as well as the pastor can support Raven and her family now and in the future? And I asked, because Alice is our expert, I asked Alice for answers to all of these questions. And I just want to read Alice's answer to this because it really, it amplifies what she just said. She said, don't ask leading questions. Just let Raven say what she needs to say. Provide her with hugs if she wants them. Reassure her that she will be okay and that you are there to help and support her. So part of when we think about how we are supporting Raven and her family, part of that support is to listen and to believe what she says, take it at face value, and let someone else, whose job it is to do the investigation. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else have thoughts about how to support Raven and her family at Mrs. B?
I mean, this is Melissa. I think certainly there could be some additional support for her grandmother, just needed to help her, kind of face the situation and just provide her with spiritual support and things like that I can imagine it would be a tough situation for her to face.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah, definitely.
Felicia, were you saying something?
Sorry, I was going to say something.
Did my volume not come through there?
Yeah, it didn't come through.
Okay. My internet's kind of messed up sometimes. I was saying we should also ask the grandmother, how can we support you? How can we help you?
Mm-hmm. Oh, good point. Good. Mary?
Well, this is just a general observation, sort of plain sense, but the more the whole congregation knows about these realities, the more they'll care. And I just think it's wonderful that we're having this. It just needs to be the knowledge of everyone in the congregation, because so much of this stuff is ignored in many families and in many churches. And it's really crucial that you all, not only what the wonderful things you're doing, but also just making this awareness happen.
Yes, thank you. I think sometimes it's difficult to quote unquote publicize more about stuff like this because so much of what I do is confidential, right?
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah, but that's why I made up this scenario, and then as just providing some of the factual information. But you're right. The more people who know the signs of abuse and the ways that they can report and how easy it is, and the fact that when you do it, there's nothing negative against you. And if it doesn't rise to the level of abuse, then the family never even knows that there was a report made. It just gets screened out. So what's the harm? You know what I mean? Yes. I think that everybody needs to know that, because even if it's not at church, it could be in your neighborhood. It could be in your own family. It could be friends of a friend. I mean, it's just information that needs to be out there.
Yes. Yeah. And we're trying to get more of this taught in the divinity school, but we're not totally there yet.
Yeah, understandable. Well, we have one more scenario, so we're going to go to that.
Okay, so in this scenario is about an elder in the church. Mr. Clark lives in a housing unit owned by his church, and some members of the church who lived there were independent, and others, such as Mr. Clark, had caregivers who ran errands for them, such as shopping and taking them shopping. Members of the church volunteered their services in ministry to residents of this housing unit. Mr. Clark hired a caregiver from the church about 3 years ago. Before long, he began to let the caregiver pay his bills and gave him access to his bank account, including a bank card. He also gave him a key to his apartment. Church volunteers noticed the caregiver taking boxes of items from the apartment on several occasions, but they did not question Mr. Clark or the caregiver. Mr. Clark was a retired college professor, never married, and had no living relatives. He was involved in Sunday school and Bible study. Next slide. Mr. Clark died suddenly, but had been in good health, although he was almost 90 years old. He had given the resident director his important papers, including his last will and testament and funeral arrangements. Mr. Clark left half of his estate to the church and the other half to the college where he had been a professor. Before the distribution was made, Mr. Clark's caregiver filed an objection in the court, claiming that Mr. Clark had an updated handwritten will, which he procured, that gave all of the estate to the caregiver. There was an investigation, and the caregiver had been taking funds from Mr. Clark's account and had purchased a new car using Mr. Clark's name shortly before his death. The result was that the church and college were found to be the rightful beneficiaries of Mr. Clark's estate, and the caregiver was ordered to make restitution for the value of the new car and the other funds that had been removed from Mr. Clark's account prior to his death. Okay, so thinking about this case study, how would you describe Mr. Clark's behavior?
I think he was just a little too trusting. He needed someone to help him, and he believed that giving him access, the key to his apartment, giving him access to his funds, was to help him and not to harm him. So I think Mr. Clark was just a little too trusting in terms of his caregiver.
Mm-hmm.
We're assuming that Mr. Clark was aware of all of his caregiver's activities, and he very well may not have been, because if he had relinquished all of his, paperwork and so forth to the caregiver, that meant he wasn't seeing these things on a regular basis or his bank statement. So I guess what I would have wondered is if he was still coming to church, what kind of interaction he had with his other congregational members, and if anybody else noticed anything.
That's a good point. And kind of in contrast to other people who lived in this unit, in this housing unit, Mr. Clark needed this home health care. So he was not as independent as some other people.
Now, I was going to add, he might have felt like he didn't have any other choice, because if he was potentially homebound or had other things that interfered with him to do it, that, as Selena said, he was being very trusting, but he also might have felt, I can't even think of the word, but just more or less like he didn't have any other choice. Like he needed that support.
Mm-hmm. Mary, we didn't quite get that. Mary Jones.
No, I was just saying that considering his age, he might have been coerced into doing these things, and not really being aware of exactly what he was doing.
That's right. So thinking about the caregiver, how would we describe the caregiver's actions and what might have been some red flags?
They were criminal, and it's unfortunate that other people didn't observe what was happening when the boxes were leaving and make it a point to be in touch with Mr. Clark.
Yeah, so would there have been a problem asking why might someone not say something if you see, the caregiver leaving with boxes, more than once? why wouldn't somebody necessarily ask what's going on?
Sometimes people just feel like it's not their business.
Yeah,
Yeah, people don't want to get involved.
right.
That's right.
I
So-
wonder if caregiver was screened prior to taking the position. How was he selected?
We don't know, but that's a really good point, because that if the caregiver was from the congregation and it said that there was a ministry to provide help to the residents, then that could be something that the church could look at, is how do they screen, and not just initially, but how do they monitor ongoing caregivers, and do they have background checks? Do they have check-ins, and what kind of accountability structures are set up? So that's a really good point. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. There's a couple of more questions. Just to be explicit here, was Mr. Clark a victim of financial abuse, exploitation, both, either?
Both, for sure.
Oh, I would say both.
Mm-hmm. And then thinking preventively, we already have started this with the last comment on the previous slide, but what could the congregation have done to prevent this whole situation?
Do congregations typically know about everybody's money and their plans for what they're going to do with their money?
I just think if more of the congregation had been visiting him, they would have observed some of this. They could have just been there to be a friend to him, to support him and thank him for the work he did for the church, offer him some spiritual substance. Certainly they would have seen things leaving his apartment, knowing that things are less. They'd have seen the care that was being given or not given to Mr. Clark. So I think having more involvement of the church membership would have been.
And they might have been able to do some of those things for him, and he would not have had a need to have Mr. Clark to take care of his finances in that respect, you know.
And I think
that they could have been someone that he could have trusted, you know, with his affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and certainly the caregiver went totally overboard in terms of like purchasing the car in his name and things like that. But let's, on the other side of it, you know, if it began as something, perhaps taking those things off the table, but, you know, if there was a case where perhaps Mr. Clark was asking the caregiver, you know, I need to start getting rid of things in my home. Can you take these things to Goodwill? Can you do this? I think on the flip side, if anyone's in a scenario where they're being asked to help, just sharing that with someone else, you know, in this case, it could be with the pastor or whatever, just saying, okay, here's what this individual is asking me to do. And I want to make sure it's, you know, that others understanding, because I'm not trying to take advantage. I think just being clear and open about that could be the case as well. Again, in this situation, clearly the caregiver was way over, you know, due, but there could be scenarios where someone is genuinely asking for that help. And, you know, it's just always good to communicate with someone else so that you don't be put in a situation where you're looked at in a bad light.
Those are really good points. And I'd like to just kind of reiterate a couple of things. First in this particular scenario, it was involved in a ministry of the church. And so there was opportunity for more oversight. But on the other hand, you know, we brought up how if we are connected to the members of our church, we will have opportunity to see some things. And again, the whole point of this training is to introduce the idea of financial abuse, spiritual abuse or neglect, so that we're more likely to recognize it when we see it. Or if we have a question, we can ask about it, you know. And on the flip side, you know, as members of our congregation are going through difficult times, whether it's a temporary or whether it has to do with growing older and maybe becoming unable to function as we have up until now, you know, knowing that our church congregation is a place where we can get help, and being able to rely on that help to be, and for people who are helping to have accountability and protection that's what our church is about. That's what this training is about. So thanks everybody again for your participation in these case scenarios.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
you,
you,
Danita.
Danita.
I just want to thank everyone for attending today. I thought, that is the rest of our information here. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen because it just says thank you. Yes, so I thought this was a wonderful opportunity to introduce some new pieces of our training. We're trying to incorporate more information about older and vulnerable adults. We also wanted to clarify more about the discipline policy and about how like volunteers can go directly to the parents as well as speak to the children's church chair. Those are some examples of some of the additions. So we will make sure everybody gets a copy of the new policy, and we're going to be sending everybody a lovely proficiency survey, and no pressure. We're not going to be, passing and failing anybody. We really appreciate your participation and your questions and your input today. And your proficiency survey will count as your attendance as taking the annual training. And at the end, you will see that you will attest to the Safe Sanctuary policy. And I just want to take this time. Is there questions that have not been answered? I will say you could ask them here. You could also email any of us on the committee. That would be myself, Donita, Nicolette, Sashir, Dr. Johnson, Gloria, Pastor Rachel Hardy, who could not be here today. So any of us can answer questions as well offline. If you would prefer to do that outside of the training, that's fine as well. But we really appreciate your attendance.
Can you tell me when we'll get the slide deck, or where to get it, if you're going to post it somewhere, how I can pull it down?
Oh, good question. Well, we could send that out today or tomorrow, and then we're recording this training, and our resident tech guru, Robert, will help us get it posted to YouTube, I think, for people to watch again, or for people who were not able to attend to watch. So that's a good question. We want you to do the proficiency survey without the slides and see how well you do. Yeah. Other questions?
Would it be appropriate to post it on the website?
Like the slides?
The training, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, I can get up with Robert and see what could be done about that.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And for some of us who are dummies technologically, mm-hmm. would we get an email telling us to go there or something?
Yeah, you guys are all going to get an email with the proficiency survey.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And if that's not later today, it'll be sometime tomorrow, because I want to make sure I have everybody's correct email address who's on this training. So, mm-hmm. Good questions. Good questions. Well, I just like to do a closing prayer, because just want to kind of tie it all back to why we're all here. And then I thank you so much for your time, and we won't hold you, so we will conclude the training after that. So if you can just bow your heads with me, just, dear Lord, thank you for gathering us here this morning. Thank you for bringing us together to discuss some very necessary, but often very difficult topics about how to protect and prevent the abuse and neglect of the least of your kingdom. And just please help us as we continue to go forward as a congregation to just, when we see something, for us to say something, for us to hold each other accountable, and just to continue to be a place of warmth, of love, of respect, continue to deepen those relationships so that we can see when something may not be going in the right direction in a family, and we can potentially help that situation. We pray for new creation, for our continued growth as a congregation. We pray especially for our children, our youth, our older and vulnerable adults. Keep them in your prayers today. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thank you, guys. We really
Thank you all.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Y'all have a good Saturday.
Thank you.
Appreciate the
Bye.
information.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.